Hey guys, Shouldoge here. Today we are looking at the Tenta-X Jinsoku. Tenta-X started widely retailing their pads in late 2023 and really rose to popularity in late 2024 after the release of their Octo Grip and Glass Pad series. This pad is supposed to be Tenta-X's flagship speed pad, the counterpart to their Shinrai, which was formerly known as the Octo Grip, also known as their flagship control pad. You can buy the pad now on the official Tenta-X store, which is only available in 490 by 420 millimeters as of now, in either the Midnight Purple, which I have here, or the Void Black. Now, moving onto the surface, looking at a macro shot, the stitching is pretty tight. Not perfectly consistent, but there is a nice pattern in that it looks fairly even in terms of following that pattern. There isn't any fraying, and the threads themselves are very thick, making for a very defined texture. The general feel of this surface has a very defined, soft, yet granular texture, which I wouldn't quite call smooth, but skin-friendly enough to the point where I couldn't imagine anyone getting irritation with it. Once again, and this seems to be a trend as of recently, I would say the surface of this pad is most comparable to the Infinity Mice Ruin. The speed of these two pads is very similar, with the Jinsoku being just a tad faster than the Ruin in my opinion. But the only real difference between these two pads would have to be the surface texture, with the Ruin feeling a bit softer than the Jinsoku, and I would say Jinsoku's texture being more defined than the Ruin. I've been testing this pad with the magic ice dots included with the pad, and I have to say the overall speed of this pad is very fast. When lightly gliding across the surface, the static friction is little to none, while the dynamic friction is a bit stronger when making slow movements, but becomes much more comparable to the static friction when making faster movements. Additionally, the static friction gets much stronger the more you press into the pad, making for some great variability. Due to the defined texture of the surface of this pad, I find myself able to stop fairly easily when gliding across, and when I really need to come to a stop, I find I can press into the pad to make a stop on a dime. This is a very interesting surface in that while the y-axis does feel a bit more textured, I would say the x-axis feels like it has a bit stronger of a static frictional value. It's nothing that you can feel during regular use of the pad, but it's definitely there, especially when you press down into the surface. This pad is quite magical in its humidity resistance. I'm living in around 70% humidity as of now, and it still feels as fast as if I were to use it in a dry environment. Sometimes with sweat I'll feel my forearm stick to the pad a bit, but I feel like that's more of an effect of me having rather skinny wrists compared to my forearm. I haven't had too much trouble with my palm or fingertip sticking to the surface due to sweat. While none of my other sleeves have worked inverted or uninverted with this pad, the Kibu sleeve which I've recently gotten has been performing very well with this pad. It's not 100%, but I never find myself dragging my forearm while using this sleeve on this pad. Though due to the surface working with only a quarter of my sleeves, I can't quite call it sleeve friendly, rather just sleeve usable. Due to the properties of the surface weave, it is quite easy for debris to get stuck in between the threads, which isn't too much of an annoyance considering it isn't a smoother surface, but it is quite hard to get it out, so you'll have to use tweezers or your nails to be able to keep it nice and clean. Moving on to the base consists of a polyurethane foam and is described as being somewhere between a soft and X-soft base. The base is definitely adherent, but not quite as sticky as some other options like Matrova or Ultraglide's polyurethane bases, for example, but it definitely stays neatly on the desk, and you can hear a bit of peeling when you take the pad off your desk, a sign of good adherence. The base is listed as 3.5 millimeters thick, which works very well with this pad. The description of the base on the website is correct in it being somewhere in between an X-Soft and soft style base, and I would say it's leaning more toward X-Soft when using Artisan's bases as an example. From the properties of this base, I can only assume that the adherence isn't from something that could degrade over time, and rather just the structure of the polyurethane that allows it to stick to the desk. Although, with a thinner base, it won't adhere as well as 4mm bases. The rebound is quite quick, and I feel it's just a tad slower than most standard pour-on bases, and especially is comparable to the quickness of X-Soft pour-on bases. The base does feel like it has a lot more give, but with the tight properties of the surface weave, it feels much closer to a soft base, and it brings a very nice balance between being able to press in for extra control and giving dot skates a solid support so that you can press in a good amount before they start to even out. Moving on to the stitching, as for the pattern, they did adopt a new stitching pattern style with this base, different from the Octo Grip or Shinrai in that the base pokes through a bit more from the bottom of the edges. Sort of similar to Matrova's stitching style rather than the LGG standard series like the Octo Grip had. The stitching is definitely more firm than the rest of the base. Not so much to the point where it's not able to be pressed in, but enough so that you can feel it when you rest your arm on it. Though the big caveat here is that it doesn't quite even out with the rest of the base when pressing down, which I can give a little bit of grace here since it is only a 3.5mm base, and it can be hard to get stitching right with a base this thin. There's a reason why 4mm is the standard, and this is one of the reasons. For the parts of the edge stitching that do settle, the edge stitching is just a tiny bit below the surface of the pad, though some of the edges on my copy are a bit curled upward, though not enough to the point where it falls above the surface, but enough to the point where it can't quite be below the surface. As for the quality, the surface is uncoated and feels very consistent. There doesn't seem to be any spots where the speed changes on this pad, and humidity hasn't nearly affected the speed of this pad as much as other options in my collection. The color of this pad is very nice on the surface, but the edge stitching is a bit odd in that some spots look lighter than others. Maybe an issue with heat treatment, I'm not exactly sure on that. On the Tenta-X website, this mousepad is described as a lightning-fast speed pad with effortless movements, and I do have to agree. This pad is one of, if not the fastest pads I've ever used, and it just feels even faster if you're using the Kibu sleeve. At that point, it's like you're moving on ice. There is a waxy logo that is a bit raised compared to the rest of the surface, but not too high to the point where it's annoying, compared to Lethal Gaming Gear's implementation where you'll feel it, but it won't necessarily become a problem. While there were some surface oddities of smoothness of the base upon first use, it oddly seems to smoothen itself out upon use. Either way, upon using it for around a week, there are still some spots near the edges where you feel tiny ripples in the base. It is generally very smooth to glide across, and I imagine it only gets smoother with more use put into it. There are some spots where the edge stitching pokes out a bit more than it usually would, but the dimensions of the pad itself are fairly consistent and match with the 490 by 420mm as described on the website when purchasing this pad. Despite its close to X soft base, I couldn't find any air pockets on this pad, contrary to other X soft pads on the market. Combined with the overall properties and evenness of this base makes it one of my favorites that I've used. As for the stitching, while the stitching is fairly even and there isn't too much fraying, as I stated earlier, for some reason parts of the edge stitching do look a bit lighter than others. Again, not sure why that is, but you do notice it when you start to look at the edges of the pad. I imagine this wouldn't be as much of an issue with the void black version if you are a perfectionist. While there are some spots where the stitching doesn't meet below the surface of the pad, I do like how clean the implementation is for the edge stitching of this pad, as it gives a nice distinction as to where the surface ends and the stitching begins. Despite a pretty good amount of use, there is no fraying near the edge where I place my arm. As for the customer experience, the customer service from Tenta-X can be a bit hard to reach, but overall provides a very nice experience. The founder watched my last review and told me a lot about the product I didn't know about, and led me through his process for making the Jinsoku when I did receive mine, and was keen on sending a replacement if anything happened to be wrong with it. The community is decently active, with the founder being a highlight of it, as he's always open to talking about his products and is very active across his Discord and X accounts. The Discord space is definitely active and is kept alive by the nice teasers which Azar, the founder, employs. I pre-ordered mine, and so while I can't say much on the shipping times, as that would be a bit unfair, once it did arrive in the US, it didn't take any longer than a week to arrive at my door. The box did come in a little bit bent, which I believe caused the edges to curl, though I don't know if that happened while being shipped out of China or being shipped into the US. Either way, there wasn't any irreparable damage to the pad, and I was able to leave it rolled up for 2 24-hour periods, and the curling is nearly completely gone. As for the price, this pad with shipping totaled to just around $44, which is fairly nice considering an accessory they included, which I'll talk about shortly. The pad is packaged in a new box, which features an easy-to-open Velcro design. Also makes for really nice reusability. As I stated earlier, this pad comes with a very nice accessory, with it being Unusual Ways Magic Ice Dots, the skates that they recommend for this pad. Not sure why more companies don't do this, but it made for a much better experience overall, and if not for that, then you're just getting a free pack of dot skates with this pad. It also comes with a plastic card and 2 stickers, with one of them being more of a clear vinyl. And for everything you get with this pad, including the pad itself, I would say this pad is well worth the price, especially if you're in the market for a speed pad that's ready out of the box and long after. In conclusion, I would recommend this pad to someone who wants the fastest mouse pad they can get without crossing too far over the line of reaching glass-like territory. With all things considered, including the generosity of Tenta-X throughout this process, and this pad truly being one of my favorite speed experiences, I'll have to rate this pad a 89 out of 100. I will certainly be buying from Tenta-X again. I'm hoping they make the same improvements to the Shinrai as the Jinsoku got. With that being said, thank you so much for watching. Bye-bye.